But I think in the Scottish context that has been really important, and at times it gets quite challenging to remember what hat you're wearing at the time. And it also has meant we've had, from a Scottish Women's Budget Group perspective, had some really funny experiences along the way that have been really quite yes ministery type experiences of, you know, you say it here and it comes out there, or having to keep a straight face when somebody's saying, would you mind asking a question, and you know that you've written it the night before and it's gone through and comes back out. They say, how would you feel if you were asked this question? You go, I think I'd be quite happy to answer that because I wrote it. So it's to do with the kind of smaller polity and the permeability to some extent of the institutions of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government do, I think, characterise our experience as quite distinctive in Scotland and not necessarily replicable or having been replicated elsewhere, particularly the role of the parliamentary committees. But before I get on to all of that, who are we and what do things look like in Scotland, I thought might be quite helpful. Our statistics aren't really all that much different perhaps from your own, and certainly not that much different from the north either. What I would point out is the 35% of MSPs are women. That's been in decline since the great achievements of the first elections to the Scottish Parliament, where we were just under 43%. So there's been a kind of steady decline and a stalling across local government. Colleagues at Edinburgh University, Fiona Mackay and Meryl Kelly, describe the ongoing character of local government in Scotland as it's still pale, male and stale. And we're not really, again, we're seeing a decline in women coming through the party systems and coming through the selection procedures. There are still kind of pockets of women-only shortlists, and still the ongoing pockets of resistance to women-only shortlists in the various parties. The other thing I suppose to point out is the massive representation of women in local government in Scotland, and the character that goes to the character of the Scottish economy as well, in terms of the size of our public sector in Scotland. So with governments pursuing public sector reform measures or austerity measures, both of which are quite often interchangeable terms, it would seem, then women are significantly affected both as workers and as service users and as household care providers and care managers in public service reform, public service spending cuts. In Scotland, our black and minority ethnic population is just under 2%, with slightly then higher levels of other indicators of deprivation or representation or labour market participation. And in terms of disability, of a 5.2 million population, there's a statistic missing there. Over 1 million people have long-term conditions in a population of 5 million. So in terms of our public spending and the implications of what will be a 4.5 billion reduction in welfare spending under the UK coalition government cuts to, it's not, in my view, welfare reform, it's removal of social protection. And the effect that will have both on individuals, on households and on the Scottish economy has yet to be bottomed out. And I had opportunity the other night, the chief economist to the Scottish government, who's really on side, and so at times it feels a bit unfair to have a go, but in giving a masterclass at Glasgow Caledonian, he was saying he felt there were certain signs of optimism in the Scottish economy. I couldn't quite see them from what he was saying, but I thought, well, maybe that's because I'm not an economist and I can't see things that economists see. But in answer to how does the optimism, will his optimism last as these benefit cuts kick in what will be the fourth successive year of decline in the Scottish Government budget spending as well. So will that optimism extend to catch as people fall in the next few years? And I don't know, and I think a lot of us are extremely worried and concerned about what's going to happen. And in an economy where the public sector have been so dominant and the private sector recovery has not manifested. And again, to be fair to the Scottish Government, in evidence to the Scottish Parliament Equal Opportunities Committee in the autumn, the Finance Secretary was candid enough to say we got it wrong. You know, our two principal assumptions were that the private sector would pick up some of the jobs that we were losing from the public sector. That didn't happen. And the other assumption was that by bringing forward capital spending and using consequentials from the UK government under the Barnett formula and trying to stimulate investment capital projects, that would have a knock-on effect, and that hasn't happened, and we got it wrong. And I think whenever you have a relationship or you have worked with politicians, you get them to the extent where they will say publicly we got it wrong, demonstrates a willingness to get it right. And that's, I think, how I would want to characterise some of what I'm going to say. I hadn't expected to say any of that, so that's kind of a flavour of where we might go from here. So, I mentioned there that the Scottish budget is in its fourth year of decline. Just to be clear, the context in Scotland is that we have, our budgets are effectively spending plans. The Scottish Government budget is principally through what's called the Barnett formula, which is our block grant from the UK Government. And the Scottish Parliament, under the Scotland Act 98, has tax varying powers. It can vary levels of tax by 1% either way, but no administration has ever invoked that provision. But that's about to change. The budget for 2013-14 is 34 billion, but the actual kind of spending, the departmental expenditure limit, is 26 billion, and that's down from 30 billion a couple of years ago. But over the first 10 years of the Parliament, we saw the budget increase from 15 million up to that 30 billion. So we're now, there was a huge boom in public spending, if you like, in Scotland. But we're now seeing that, and I understand regression is a word that's been used already this morning, and I think we can all look to where gains, inequality, representation, legislation, policy making, infrastructure, and just discussing equality in a positive and progressive way is part of the climate as well, I think, of regression. However, within that climate, the Scottish Women's Budget Group have existed since 1999-2000, all fueled up and energised and excited by the institutional changes of devolution in 1999 and the back of as I say, inspired by and energised by things like the 50-50 campaign for women's representation in the Scottish Parliament, the whole discussion and ethos and excitement of a new politics in Scotland. Oh my goodness, were we ever so naive? But anyway, it was a really exciting time to be active politically and to be a feminist activist in Scotland at the time. And it still is, don't get me wrong, we're still having a lot of the same arguments, but anyway, that's the way it goes. So some friends and colleagues in the Scottish Women's Budget Group thought, there's some chat about this idea of gender budgeting, what's all this? The Commonwealth Secretariat are talking about it, they've been dabbling in it in Australia beforehand, then the Beijing Platforms for Action from the 1995 World Conference on Women sort of gave it an institutional leverage and legitimacy, if you like, that the budget was fair game, if you like, and started to bring together in a more formal way some of what had been happening with academic scholars in feminist economists and in gender and development thinking as well, bringing together the idea of how we spend our money has an effect on how we exacerbate and perpetuate or how we eliminate and challenge inequalities, and to bring that analysis together. So we kind of cast around and looked to Canada, looked to Australia, looked to anybody who was doing things at the time, brought them over. So far, so similar in a sense. And at that time, the Basque government in northern Spain were starting to look around, so they were looking to us, which was quite interesting because at times we were really only a few steps ahead of the people that we were trying to influence. You'd read stuff the night before and go in and pontificate very very persuasively as it transpired, and then have to go and read the next step when they said yes. You're, oh crikey, right, now what do we do? So there were some very important early gains. Again, back to the size of Scotland and the multiple roles that people perform. So through women who were parliamentary researchers, we got access to the Finance Minister. Through the Director of the Equal Opportunities Commission at the time, again further access to the Finance Minister and the Finance Convener. So early meetings were really important, and led to the Finance Minister at the time standing up in Parliament saying, having talked to these women about alternative ways of working our budget, we think we're onto something here and we're going to pursue that. That was in 2000. The first equality statement on the budget was 2009. So change can happen, but it takes a long time, I think is what I might say. Over that time, the Scottish Women's Budget Group has continued to function as an unfunded, voluntary collective in a sense. We don't even have a constitution. Every now and again we go, oh, we need to formally constitute ourselves, we need to get organised. We go, yeah, but we also need to write a response for this, and we need to do this, that and the other. So far, again, so familiar to, I think, probably everybody in the room. But by 2005, having made our first response to the first spending plans in 1999-2000, and then kept that up, responding all the time to the draft budgets, the draft spending plans, the annual expenditure report, because at the same time we were trying to learn and influence a budget process, we were trying to influence something that was new, so we had the opportunity of, one hoped anyway, of the benefits of a new process. So there wasn't that nested and invested interests. But I think that was maybe an overestimation on our part, because we were up against a fairly big, or working with a big bureaucracy, which itself was new and unsure. And so those early years, there was a whole lot of nervousness and lack of clarity as to what even the budget process was for the civil servants who were working within that environment as well. So in 2003, there was quite a canny move by colleagues in the Scottish Women's Budget Group to conduct a piece of research for the Scottish Government, or Scottish Executive as it was then, on understanding the Scottish budgetary process, which was quite a smart move. So it took Scottish Women's Budget Group activists as academics into the budget process. That helped explain it to us and gave us a really good advocacy tool. But it also helped explain it to the civil servants who were working in a new environment, and I think everybody had underestimated that. So by 2005, and this sounds a wee bit like blowing my own trumpet, or our collective trumpet, but it did come as a kind of surprise to us that we weren't just being gobby feminists. We did have something positive and credible and important to say, and we're doing it in a way that was bringing about some change. So there was an external evaluation of women's activism and civil society activism in Scotland. The Scottish Women's Budget Group at that point was described as a credible and authoritative voice in lobbying. And just last year we were described as policy entrepreneur par excellence. How fine. But it is fine. It's really good when we've sat around many a kitchen table writing policy responses and life going on round about us. Literally, I've been heavily pregnant writing policy responses. As my children seem to have coincided with budget cycles on repeated years. Never a good plan. But anyway, so life going on round about us, and but we've continued to draw strength from others, and I think that's really important. We've always looked to what's going on elsewhere in other countries. Ailsa Mackay was one of the founding members of the Parliament, and Ailsa's now Professor of Economics at Glasgow Caledonian. And over the time, met up with other budgeting initiatives in Europe who have now formed the European Gender Budgeting Network that hopefully you'll be hooked into as well, because there's all sorts of tools being used, all sorts of different methodologies and different approaches being adopted, different theoretical constructs around them. In Italy, for example, a lot of emphasis on well-being and using the whole idea of the capabilities approach of deconstructing local government budgets into and trying to align statutory responsibilities with the whole idea of creating and delivering greater equality and better well-being. in Spain, people working on tax benefits and working on revenue systems, which again is of relevance to yourselves here and as increasingly in Scotland, and that whole question of who do you raise revenue from, who pays and how. So over our time, I think it's fair to say we have been engaged but critical actors, and that has been very challenging at times as we've become, we have the agonising discussions every now and again, are we being co-opted by government because we do all of this unfunded, unpaid, unresourced analysis in our own time, or are we doing that because we're challenging and it's a feminist policy change coming about by challenging the established institutions. There's about 40 women on the list. We have a bigger kind of information network as well, and a small core who are the kind of regular contributors to the responses process. Over the period we've had wee bits of money. We had 2 grants from Oxfam under their UK poverty programme, and that allowed us to employ a worker for about 2 years on a very limited basis, so very typical of the sector. You thoroughly overwork your one worker and all of that. So again, you're familiar with that. And then we didn't really have the infrastructure, to be fair, to be able to manage that. And I think we then sensibly said, Keys, we need to just make some decisions. If we're not going to formally constitute, if we're going to continue in this very kind of loose associative way that's working for us, that's fine. Or we need to take other decisions and sort out some of the formal structures. And when you've got everything else going on, that was a decision we decided to set aside. And we've done that a couple of times. We set aside that decision. I think it's open for debate again, whether or not we need to formalise ourselves and our constitution and our structure and so on. But in that time, I come back to the point I made there about co-option and how close do you get to government when you're trying to change government, and when are you a critical friend and when are you a critic. And they've been quite important challenges, I think, for us along the way. That the horrible acronym there, EBAG, is very much improved. That's now the Equality Budgets Advisory Group. But for years it was, and I need to take a big deep breath here, it was the Equality Proofing Budgets Policy Advisory Group. I kid you not. The Equality Proofing Budgets Policy Advisory Group. Now you think, by way of institutional resistance, there's a clue, really. But anyway, however, I'll talk a wee bit more about EBAG in a minute. When the Finance Minister, Jack McConnell, in 2000 stood up and said to the Parliament that he was quite interested in what this bunch of women had to say about alternative budgeting, he agreed to set up an internal structure, and that was the Equality Proofing Budgets Policy Advisory Group. And that has been a really important channel, and we fought very hard to keep that open, much as it's drawn us in at times too much as it has completely failed to function at times as well. But I certainly was always of the view, if we walk away, we won't get back in. And so it's in our interest to keep that channel open. And one of the ways that we used to keep that channel open was the committees in the Parliament. And by encouraging committees to ask questions of the workings of the Equality Proofing Budgets Policy Advisory Group and making it public that it wasn't working was a useful way to stimulate ongoing engagement, and was a case of, you say it here and it comes out there at times, which was quite interesting as well. But the parliamentary committees have been absolutely key, I think, in the Scottish experience. The budget comes out in September time, there's a consultation period, and all committees scrutinise the budget to greater or lesser effect and greater or lesser extent. Since 1999, the Finance Committee's had a special advisor in the budget process. The Equal Opportunities Committee only took on a special advisor from 2007, who also coincidentally happened to be Professor Ailsa Mackay of Glasgow Caledonian University and founder member of the Scottish Women's Budget Group, funnily enough. But having that parliamentary scrutiny and having some strategically placed key actors, however we want to call them, in parliamentary positions to work with us, who wanted to be informed, who wanted to be better informed, who wanted to perform more effective challenge and scrutiny on the budget, and who would champion equality analysis within the budget, has been absolutely crucial. Because I would say by about 2007, 2008, we were exhausted as the Scottish Women's Budget Group. We were really getting fed up as well. It felt we were getting pushed back. Progress had really dipped. And I can talk more about the details of that. But the parliamentary scrutiny and having the Parliament ask, albeit by that point, by 2007 into 2008, a new government, difficult questions, spurred that new government on. And so following a period of challenge and scrutiny in 2007 and 2008, we had the first equality statement attached to the budget in 2009. Along the way, the tensions have been fairly significant at times and have occupied a huge amount of time, have taken up a massive amount of energy, and the tension all the time of, are we trying to change the budget process? We're going to focus on the process in the hope that by transforming the process it will lead to more transformatory outcomes in the decisions that are made, or do we focus on policy and policy analysis and do endless arguments about why, if you've got better quality analysis, you will have better skills policy, childcare, health policy. And is it our responsibility? Who's making policy? We can say what we like as outsiders about policy, so maybe we should encourage change in the policy process so that policymakers are making better decisions about policy. And that's in a sense been the approach that has dominated or characterised the Scottish approach, has been about the process. And working through the Equality Budgets Advisory Group, where the Equality Unit, who sadly you've not been able to hear from today, and who in fairness wouldn't have demurred or disagreed, I don't think, with a lot of what I've said. They might not have said it the way I said it, but so we've worked on the process, understanding the process and trying to build in equality analysis along the way. And the Public Sector equality duties from 2006 have been crucial, or at least have been significant tools. I maybe shouldn't say they've been crucial because of the extent to which they have been implemented and fully exercised. 2008, Yvonne, who would have spoken to you today, giving evidence to the Equal Opportunities Committee when pressed on the extent to which equality impact assessment was being carried out within the Scottish Government, said that at that point in the budget scrutiny process, but across all Scottish Government programmes, spending programmes, only 80 draft equality impact assessments had been attempted. 80 of a whole raft of policies and programmes. And that's even with all the infrastructure, if you like, that goes with the positive duties, the annual reports, the gender equality scheme, the annual reports and the gender equality scheme under the old duties, and now under the new duties and the focus on outcomes. We're starting to see a bit of a shift. So they've been a useful tool, and I think it's important, we were having this discussion over lunch as well, when you have something, you have this lever, you have to use it. And it's maybe not worked as well as we would have wanted, but if we hadn't had it, we wouldn't have had it to use. And in 2003, the Equality Budgets Advisory Group agreed to commission some pilots. So having worked on how the budgetary process worked, we still weren't getting the message through. So we said, well, what about some pilot studies? Why don't we look at spending departments and spending programmes and trace the journey and look at where the trigger points are and the access points are for analysis. So there was, again, very typically, small-scale marginal spending programmes. Smoking cessation and young women's participation in sport were chosen as the pilot areas. The pilots were completed and took a year and a half to be published. And at that time we were getting really, really fed up, and the parliamentary committees were getting really fed up as well. And one of the blockages was not just the failure to publish, but was by then we had the new duties, and the recommendations from the pilots would have fitted with the impact assessment guidelines, but it was felt that they didn't want to overburden the policymakers, even though there was this dovetailing. So along the way there have been some quite significant glitches that have prevented. The other challenge, of course, is being when an initiative is government-led, does it move much quicker than when it's externally stimulated? And that, I think, has been a constant tension, because who are government leading, or are they responding, and what are they responding to? Very significant tension has been around equality and equalities, and by that I mean our progress has been mixed, as I've said, and the conceptual fuzziness that has dominated, I think, has been really significant. Scottish Women's Budget Group talk about gender budgeting. We talk about women and men's inequality, women and men's differential experience as a starting point, and then follow through on intersectional analysis. The commitment, now really significantly, the founding principles of the new Scottish institutions were openness, accessibility, transparency and equal opportunities. And that commitment to equal opportunities was operationalised as equalities mainstreaming, which I would argue led to a lot of misunderstanding. It led to a kind of stasis, in a sense, because there was this nervousness around anything other than what appeared to be equivalence and equal treatment and sameness, rather than relevant responses that were informed by good, reliable, effective, extensive data. And I think that has really characterised some of the problems that we've had in Scotland, along with peaks and troughs in political leadership and leadership within the civil service, when the sticky points I've talked about in terms of the pilots and so on also coincided with a time when, for example, Yvonne Strachan wasn't head of the equality unit. She was on secondment, and so things dipped. So individuals make a huge difference, and the leadership that they demonstrate. I've talked about parliamentary engagement and the establishment of the positive institutional arrangement of the Equality Budgets Advisory Group, which has been where we've had the most, in a sense, rigorous arguments about trying to change the process, where financing officials engaged in the early years and then fell away and then came back in. And so when they came back in, we had to go through all the arguments again around why equality analysis and policy making led to better outcomes, and that the budget was relevant. If we accept that the budget is the principal expression of a government's priorities, then it follows then that you have to have a good analysis, good equality analysis in there. But some of the challenging discussions we had in there were quite bizarre, quite technical about, well, the budget is about aggregates and it's high level spending. We can't possibly get into low levels of spending. We can't analyse every budget line, and all sorts of technical, or from technical to quite facetious responses to that. I have been known to say, well, at school I was always told to show my workings in the margins, and that's exactly what we're asking you to do. It is that. Through to responses from finance officials saying, well, really, what size of budget document would you want? We have to think about our carbon footprint. Really? Is that your best shot? Come on. So, there's been some interesting discussions along the way. Key to the effectiveness of the Equality Budgets Advisory Group has been the active engaged membership of finance, who have now moved from a position of resistance to leadership within the organisation. The same man who stood with his elbows, his arms folded, worrying about the size of the budget document and saying any lower aggregate analysis was an impossibility, was the one who a few months later was coming into the meeting saying, right, what we need to be doing when we're briefing the Finance Secretary is this. We have the opportunity of this, that or the other, and became a very powerful internal advocate. The Office of the Chief Economic Advisor have been part of EBAG since 2009, and so that's starting a whole other process around challenging the economic models that are in place. Analytical Services Division also came in at that time as well. The quality of the data and the breadth of the data has improved, and the linkages across government have been improving consistently. The Equality Proofing Budgets Policy Advisory Group was always an advisory group, but part of the problem was we weren't advising anybody. We were talking to ourselves, and that wasn't going anywhere. The first meeting with a finance minister was in 2000. The group was formed and didn't meet a finance minister again until 2008, when the first report went up. And that led to the Equality Budget Statement and increasing read across with the government economic strategy and a work programme coming out. In 2012, 2011, I have to stop, finance officials sat across the table and said really earnestly that they regarded equality analysis was embedded in the budget process. And so that's the point that we have to work to retain and to build on. But we have the Equality Budget Statement. From the Scottish Women's Budget Group perspective, we argue that it's not an analysis of the budget, it's a post hoc narrative accompaniment. It's not led to actually any policy shifts. Now, in 2011, the draft budget said some really important things about equality, and I'll let you digest that. Equality is a driver of growth. Inequality undermines economic growth and performance and our social well-being. So again, we're saying it here, it's coming out there. You're starting to see some of these arguments coming through. So that's 2011. 2012, for this current budget year, is all framed around tackling the root causes of inequality. And in particular, it talks about measures that have been taken by the Scottish Government, including a summit on women's employment, all of which have served to flag the current pressures on women's employment and, crucially, the limitations of economic models. And that's where we are now, that the Chief Economic Advisor is listening to people like Ailsa Mackay and others to make changes in how they are modelling and shaping the economy, how they're thinking about what goes into our economy and what makes that run. And that includes core demand, if you like, of gender budgeting and gender analysis around unpaid labour, the household and invisible labour, and making that visible. And I'm just going to end on this. Are we on to more of the same? Constitutional change, we're right back there. 18th of September 2014 is the date of the referendum. Around the same time, the Scotland Act, the new Scotland Act will kick in and taxation powers start to change. Whether we are an independent country or not, one thing is for sure, the status quo that we have just now will not be what we have on the 19th of September 2014, whatever will happen. So we're still in there, and still in there with political change as a possible opportunity for change. So the conditions of political will and leadership, I think, have been crucial in the Scottish story. Having a clear idea and clearly articulated idea of what you're arguing for and how you're aligning that. And that's caused us a lot of I think, the difficulties and the stalling that there have been. Nothing's going to happen. We will remain a civil society activist group unless the government change the budget. We can't change the budget. The government has to do that and has to act. So without engagement from finance officials and politicians who can direct resources, who can make political claims and drive things internally, then we won't get the change. And we need institutional arrangements that make sense to support that. And we can't lose the ongoing challenge and scrutiny from external interests, like the Scottish Women's Budget Group and like yourselves. So on that, I'll sit down and stop talking.